And we are back. Greetings to you, the listener. Welcome to Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. I am happy to be with you again. How's it going with you this week? I am feeling very good today. And the reason for that is because I got some action last night. And that's maybe a kind of crass way to start out a podcast intro. But, you know, honestly, I'm sure many of you out there listening have small children. And, you know, we moved. And so let's just say that romantic time between me and my wife has been a little bit scarce. But last night, we found that time, and it was a beautiful thing, and I want to celebrate that. And I'm hoping that it's not wrong of me to mention it. My wife might feel a little weird about it, but, you know, I just think that these days it feels like the realm of sexuality, it's like a frickin' minefield or something. So just to have a partner to be with and to share each other, it was wonderful, and it makes you feel good, and it's healing. And if you don't have a partner, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be like othering you or making you feel bad about that. But if you do have partnership, it's a glorious thing, and it's healing. So there you go. That's where I am right now, feeling good because my wife and I shared in love together. It's fucking beautiful. Speaking of my personal life on this podcast, got a bunch of emails from people asking me about my hip and my pain there. If you were listening a few weeks ago when I had Jill Miller on talking about her hip replacement surgery, I mentioned that I have a situation with my hip that I've sort of been in denial about, and a number of you reached out and were very supportive and offered your experiences and encouragement. And I just wanted to let everybody know that my new health insurance kicks in on the 1st of the year, and I'm going to make the appointment. I'm very aware of the studies on whether or not imaging corresponds with pain, and I understand all that, and what I'm going to do with whatever information they give me is an entirely other story, which I'll be happy to share as well. But just to know, I'm not going to just ignore it. Part of mentioning it on the podcast was to kick myself in the ass about it. So thank you very much for your concern. As always, I really do appreciate your contacts. And if you've been listening to the podcast and it's spoken to you, and for some reason you felt inspired to reach out to me for whatever reason, whether you like me or hate me or whatever, I just like that there are people out there and that we might, I don't know, have some connection on whatever level that might be. What else? Oh, I want to mention also that I have a new blog out this week, and you might want to check it out. Those of you who've been listening know it's been, almost 2 months now since I'm back from Japan and kind of settled into my life here in Pennsylvania as just an independent yoga teacher. I'm teaching at 2 different centers right now. I teach 5 classes a week, and it's just been really interesting to note for myself some differences since the last time I found myself in this position in the wild world of being an independent yoga teacher, which many of you listening are, I know. And a lot's the same. You know, it's still just the same people getting together at the same time in a room that hopefully has a clean floor and doing breathing and moving exercises, hopefully to some benefit. Like, that's just the baseline, same universal thing about group yoga classes. But what is notably different is the expectations of people who come, particularly new students, people who've never been to yoga classes. I just see what to me are the results of the Instagramification of yoga. And I don't mean that in like a punky, like blogger sort of way. I mean it in the sense that 10 years ago, when I was last in the mix, there was still this sense that there was a majority of like people in the yoga world and practicing in the yoga world who still were holding on to some of the old kind of vibe of like a ragtag seeker on the edge of their consciousness trying to find out who they were. And it was like a radical choice to take that on as your life. And it involved commitment and dedication because you had to show up regularly and you had to go and ask questions and inquire. Like it was on you. Like nobody was catering to you. You had to like sort of earn it in some way. But now that yoga is so in the mainstream and it's much more a matter of like pleasing customers or something. You know, it's a business now in a way that it wasn't back then. And so if you're pleasing customers, it's just an entirely different dynamic and sensibility. And then there's just this notion that people have about yoga practice. So if you're someone who is not playing into this like fitness idea about using poses to make your body super strong and flexible and also de-stress yourself at the same time, like if you're seeing it in a more nuanced way and you're not looking at poses as a way to do fitness, a lot of times you're not meeting the expectation and therefore maybe not doing as good a business. And sometimes those folks are getting kind of pushed out because there's a pressure to conform to that conventional thing that does better business, that sells more classes. And I don't blame it entirely on the centers or anything. Like they're in a bind because they got these rising rents that they got to meet. You've heard me talk about that a million times. I'm the guy. I had the center. You all know. So it's the centers are in a bind because they're having to treat the public like as customers, you know, like to please their wishes. It's no longer about trying to like pass on, you know, the traditions of ancient wisdom cultures or whatever. I know there's a lot of question around that, but for a long time, that's what it was about. And where I tried to take it is that the implications of a yoga practice that's more about like awareness and equanimity. And I would say sometimes you see that big Instagram picture of someone doing the huge position on a rock and it'll say awareness, equanimity or some like words underneath it as though that's an example of someone having that. That's not what I'm talking about because actually to me, when I think of like awareness and equanimity in practice and how you cultivate that, what I kind of see is like, you know, maybe people just rolling around on the floor doing really simple stuff that doesn't look like much. Like it's not flashy at all. It's not flashy at all. And to cultivate that awareness and equanimity and kindness, that to me is where yoga is going to really help humanity right now. You know, that's what we need to address all the stuff that's before us, you know. So in any case, I try to talk about that some in my blog, and I'm going to continue to talk about it. I've already been bringing it up in some of my conversations that I'm recording for the podcast, so it's just an area that I'm interested in, you know, that if we want to really embrace where the real challenge in yoga is, not just to ourselves as individuals, but for what it could do for our communities and our planet, then we're going to have to find a way to place value on a yoga practice that's geared in that direction, and find a way to have it compete somehow with what I see as kind of distraction, So, for whatever that's worth, you can check out that blog on the website. And, today's podcast with Justine Mastin, it speaks to the blog in some sense, because I think I'm not the only one who's observed that shift in expectations, or in some way does not enjoy the sort of modern postural yoga culture. And the response to that is often to find other places to bring yoga, other communities. There's all this work being done to take yoga to people and places that it's not normally going. And Justine is a very wonderful example of that, as she has been bringing yoga to the geek community. And we talk about what that means and what she's doing. And I really enjoyed it, and I thought it was informative, and you are going to get to listen to it today. Before we do, let me mention my stuff. I'm doing a bit of traveling. I am going to be in London at Tri Yoga Camden, January 12th through 14th. I'm going to be in Armonk, New York at Sage and the Flying Buddha, February 3rd. I'm going to be in Chapel Hill, North Carolina at Triangle Yoga, February 16th through 18th. Also, if you are local to the Lehigh Valley, I am going to be doing an intensive over the first 2 weekends in March at Easton Yoga. You can find out about those gigs. You can listen to the archives of this podcast, or read the blog I was talking about, or find my online yoga video stuff. I want to mention that we have a holiday promotion going. If you want to purchase the practice DVD downloads or the online workshop, Gentle is the New Advanced, you can get 20% off if you use promo code HOLIDAY20. Again, that's promo code HOLIDAY20 for 20% off of your J. Brown Yoga video purchases. All of that stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Also, maybe you would show support for the podcast by going to iTunes and writing a review and giving us a star rating, or going to a blog or podcast page and making a direct donation. Your support is very helpful. Thank you for those of you who do that. Okay, I think that's fine for now. I'm going to touch base with you on the other side. But let's go ahead and sit down and talk to Justine Mastin. All right, cool. Well, Justine, it's fun to get a chance to talk to you.
Yeah, you too.
I mean, our mutual friend, Taya Wildcraft, who I think of as this like researcher and radical, yoga person out there who I really like. She sends me a note and says, hey, I think you should talk to this person who's bringing yoga to the geek community.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, what's that about? And, it's funny because there's such a thread these days, like a common, I don't know, a meme, I don't know what you call it, where it's like everybody's pissed off about there's yoga and beer and yoga and this and combining yoga with everything, and like it's this gimmicky thing, right? But I have to say, when I saw what you were doing, it kind of did a thing for me personally, because I don't know that anyone would know this, but my father, when I was a young boy, at some point, he kind of took this early retirement and spent a few years exploring a somewhat obsessive passion for comic character watches.
Oh, love it.
He amassed one of the largest, if not the largest, collections of vintage comic character watches, and then put out a definitive desktop book on the subject.
That is amazing.
So I had like a little bit of personal experience with just going on the weekends with him and kind of getting a glimpse of what I believe is a real community and culture that not a lot of people necessarily know about.
Yeah.
And so I thought, wow, you also hear this threads of like people bringing yoga to different kinds of communities. And I thought, what an interesting twist that's where you're bringing yoga. So that's what really has prompted our conversation today, just to know where you know where the motivations are coming from.
Yeah, that's great.
And so, first of all, where are you? Where are you right now?
I am in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Okay. All right. Minneapolis. And I guess from there, the only other question is how do you decide to bring yoga to, well, first of all, we got to start early. We got to say, what do you define as the geek community?
What I say is, if you consider yourself a geek, you're a geek. I don't buy into like within the community, there can sometimes be a little bit of othering, like, no, you're not a geek, you're a nerd, or whatever. But for me, it's however you self-identify. And if you consider yourself outside the mainstream, come see me, because you might feel like you fit in.
I see. So just outside of the mainstream equals geek.
Well, I mean, people can geek about anything.
That's right.
People can be geeks about sports. You know, there's fantasy football. But so if we're talking about the geek community, I think of a particular set of folks, right? I don't want to other anybody. I think of folks who go to comic conventions, like you were talking about with the character watches, like people that are into those niche markets.
The people who go to the Comic-Con in a costume. Sure.
Or just go.
Yeah.
You don't have to be in a costume.
See, I just othered somebody, didn't I? I just blew it. See, that's what I'm saying. Good. Any community counts. It's true. And I think I geek out on all kinds of things. Yeah. And so what is that quality of geeking out? It's like you're so into something that you're kind of a dork for it, or you're like you use this word fandoms that you have, like all these things that you're a huge fan of something and you have like a passion for it. So you like know way too much about it than anyone really should ever know, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like that's sort of the characteristic of the geek, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And unashamedly so. I think that's important because some people, you know, they keep their hobbies under wraps. And I feel like geeks are just at least in geek-centric spaces, are just really out there with their love for these fandoms and aren't afraid to show it.
And they've created spaces where they can feel free to do that, to just let their love shine through.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. All right, so how do you, like your background? You didn't start in yoga; you started somewhere else, right? You have counseling. Like, where does it start for you? This YogaQuest that you do.
So yoga came first.
Okay.
I became a yoga teacher in 2010.
Okay.
And that same year, I was at a pop culture convention, one of these nerd conventions. And I looked around, and people were just kind of milling about in between their panels where people, you know, talk about fandoms and things that they love. And I noticed that there wasn't any programming around wellness, and there wasn't any movement. Like there were no activities where people were moving. And it brought to my mind the fact that in mainstream Western wellness culture, it's a very specific narrative, or it was in 2010. And it was marketing to a very narrow scope of people. And geeks are not people that the wellness industry has had any interest in. Basically, the only interest mainstream wellness has had with geeks is to shame them for, staying in their parents' basements and playing video games, and how, that's not healthy.
Right,
and
right.
you need to get to
yoga doesn't count.
Right. You need to get to the gym.
Yeah.
And so it was literally one of those moments in life where I sat there and went, I need to figure out a way to make yoga not just accessible to the geek community, but really fun. And so I started working on what would that look like. And it took me a while. I went through a few iterations, but then I created the original YogaQuest class, which is a combination of fan fiction storytelling with yoga.
I see. Well, that's interesting because, I know I've heard of like sort of storytelling going yoga often to be done with kids. Mm-hmm. But yeah. I also know, I also did a little time in Dungeons and Dragons, and what I'm saying? Like I could see that combo. All right, well, so let's go back again before we get to the YogaQuest class. Okay. How do you end up at that conference as a yoga teacher? What made you decide to go to the nerd conference?
Oh, I'm a lifelong nerd.
Yeah. So that's something that started early on for you? Yeah,
that came first, if we're saying what came first. Okay. I've always been a weirdo, and, I'm 30.
How early do you pin that for always?
I would say from always, but my first fandom was Twin Peaks. Okay. And I watched it during its original run. Mm-hmm. I'm 38 now, so I probably would have been 11 when it was first on, which, not super age appropriate.
That's funny, actually. I did watch Twin Peaks every episode its first run, too, but I was older than that. But I watched it, too. But I wouldn't have called myself a fan. I liked it, but you were like, that was your show.
Yeah, it was one of the first things I remember watching and going, wow, stories are really meaningful and impactful, and I feel like this story might be a part of my life now.
That's funny, because that story is a crazy story that's like...
I know.
That's the story of your life, huh? Twin Peaks.
Yeah. I think that's actually maybe all your listeners need to know about me to understand me as a human being.
All right. So at 11, you recognized Twin Peaks as the portal into your life. Yes. And so from there, I'm sure that's just a sensibility that you've had with other things as well, not just Twin Peaks. I'm betting other fandoms, as you put it.
Yep, absolutely. And, at the time, this would have been early 90s. The internet wasn't a thing, and I wasn't able to connect with other geeks. I didn't realize that these feelings I had about stories were something that other people shared. I thought this was just something weird about me. I'm already weird. Here's more weird stuff about me. And
you didn't have internet groups to find out that you're a million of people like that, more.
No, I didn't know. And I'm from central Pennsylvania, so it's not like there was a big comic convention somewhere where I could go and see my people. So I felt pretty alone in it for a long time.
And when did you, and was that time you went to that nerd convention, having already been a yoga teacher, was that wasn't the first time you went to a convention? When was the first time you went to actually find other people who are like that? Or like you?
What's funny actually is that might have been my first proper convention that I went to in 2011. Or 2010.
Oh, I see.
Because I tried for a while to be really normal. I think all weirdos go through that period of time where they're like, I'm not going to be weird anymore. I'm going to be like everybody else. And then they realize that fits like an ill-fitting, itchy sweater. And I discovered that year that there was a convention here in Minneapolis. And I just went, and I was like, oh, hey, there's other weirdos like me. And I had known that other weirdos existed, but it was the first time I'd gone into a space where it was just really joyful in that way. There had been other cons I had wanted to go to, but I was I was freaked out. I didn't know if I was like, am I weird enough? Am I weird in the right ways? It's kind of that othering thing. I was afraid of that because as someone who's always been strange, I've been othered my whole life. And so there's that fear of, is this space going to other me too? So that may have been the first time that I went actually to a convention.
And you had already become a yoga teacher before then. So when does the yoga start for you? Before or after you were wearing the itchy self that wasn't weird?
So I was a little bit in itchy sweater town when I started doing yoga. For me, I started, I had gone through a few iterations. I went to yoga with my mom when I was a kid, and I had been a dancer. I have a dance background, and I was like, this is slow. I don't like this. Get me out of here. And then I kind of wrote it off because I'm like, this isn't dance. And then I came back to it in college. I took a class, and it was okay. And then...
Well, that's early. What years are those when you were first being exposed? Do you remember?
So these are just great questions.
Well, I'm sorry to pin you. I'm just trying to pin it. Sometimes I try to pin it in a timeline because then you can tell like what types of classes you might have been going to because
sure,
like there's a time before yoga went full mainstream and after it went full mainstream, and I think you would have stumbled into very different things depending on when that was.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So when I was a kid and I went with my mom, it would have been 80s probably.
Yeah. That's
in central Pennsylvania. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, all right. So you do a little bit of yoga in the 80s with your mom, and then what happens after that? So as you get older, when's the next time you go? When you become like in college, or when do you next go?
Yeah, so then I next take a class in college. It was just a 1-credit class. I learned how to fold my Mexican blanket correctly.
So what? That's what you remember from the class, making sure the props were right?
Yeah, it was fine. Again, it didn't really speak to me. And then I kind of really fell into... the whole big box yoga thing when Core Power opened here in early 2000s. And I started doing hot yoga and vinyasa, and that really, I think that spoke to the part of me that likes to move. And I did that for quite a while. And I actually did my yoga teacher training through Core Power. I have a lot of differences in the way I work now, but at the time it was what I needed. I liked that heat and sweating and.
Well, I had somebody on the podcast a while back who talked about Core Power Yoga's training program in specific, if I recall, and some of that like just basic stuff like seemed pretty decent stuff. Like it wasn't a bad foundation to start off of. It didn't seem to me. Depending on who teaches it, always, I think, within any school. But you moved on from there, so you started at Core Power doing hot stuff like a lot of people did. I did the same thing. And did that help with your itchy self at all?
So what's interesting, I think, as we're moving through this timeline, is it was a little ways into my yoga teacher training, and I had always felt like I was kind of a poser in yoga spaces because, like, I looked the part, right? I'm this tiny, skinny white woman, and I fit with that look, but I never felt like I fit. And it was about halfway through my yoga teacher training that I started realizing that it was because I wasn't embracing this entire part of myself. And so I maybe didn't fit there. And maybe I wasn't going to fit anywhere, and I might need to figure out how to make my own place to fit. So I stayed in the Core Power system for a while, and so you have to like audition to move up to the classes that you teach. I don't want to give away any of their trade secrets, but lots of places have auditions.
Yeah, sure. A lot of places do that, of course.
Yeah. And
is it like it's like an assessment of where you are to take the higher level classes or whatever?
Yep. And I was auditioning to do a higher level class, and I just really biffed it, which is not me, right?
happens to the best of everybody. It has a day,
Yeah, but I was like, this isn't like me to just completely biff this. And I did some introspection and realized it's because I didn't want to teach this way. And it was just another push to kind of do my own thing.
Mm-hmm. Those little signs that you get,
Mm-hmm.
I always remember there was this one thing that happened to me that was just like that, where for a long time I had this like handstand press that I used to do. It was like a regular part of my practice. Mm-hmm. And I would demonstrate that in classes pretty regularly. And then I was asked to participate in like a video shoot, like it be in someone's DVD. Mm. And I remember it was really interesting because there was a teacher of mine, his name is Mark Whitwell, and we were shooting this video, and it was about the practice that he teaches, which is very much about like adapting to individual needs. Mm-hmm. And once the cameras were rolling, like the other two people who were doing it along with me, I think they kind of let some things go a little to the wayside because we all like wanted to look good for the camera.
Yeah.
And so like they started busting out all this like kind of flashy stuff, which didn't really resemble a lot of what we normally did with our teacher. And then I was sort of like having this dilemma the whole time while I was sitting there waiting. After they were to go, I was to go. And the instructions was to like show us what your practice is, So I was sort of thinking there, well, like, I'm going to do this boring stuff, and they just did all this really interesting stuff. And when it came to me, I did this really simple stuff, which was my practice. But then at the end of it, I was like, okay, now I'll just do like a handstand. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't get up.
Oh, no.
And I tried like 3 times, and like Mark had seen me do it a million times. He kind of looked at me, and I just remember like cameras rolling. I just looked up and I was like, it's just too weird, man. Like, and then I remember when I got home, like maybe 30 minutes later, I like closed my apartment door, I like put my hands down, and I went right up into a handstand.
Because you were relaxed.
I just think it was like a thing. It was almost like the universe was saying something to me. Like that's what it made me think of when you just said what happened to you. Is like when you biffed that class. Mm-hmm. Sort of like the universe is like, no, that's actually not the direction I think is best to go, Maybe you want to go a different direction, Mm-hmm. All right, so you're like, okay, maybe core power isn't my future. Mm-hmm. And so where does it go from there? What do you do from there? Do you seek out other kinds of practice and other kinds of teachers, or do you just sort of like start to let your inner nerd out? How does that happen?
Yeah, I basically let my inner nerd out. What I did was at that convention that I went to, I just by some chance discovered that there is a place in Minneapolis, it still exists, called the Geek Partnership Society. And the Geek Partnership Society had a club called Geek Physique. And I reached out to them and I said, hey, I'm a yoga teacher, I'm a nerd, I want to put those things together. I don't really know what it's going to look like yet, but would you have any interest in me coming over and figuring it out with you guys? And they were a little confused to begin with.
And what do you think? What do you think the initial confusion? Just like nerd and yoga don't seem to go together? Or?
Yeah, I think they were like, "What are you talking about?" Because historically, yoga spaces had not been welcoming of the geek community. That had not been, a population that yoga spaces are like, yes, please bring us your weirdos. And so me saying I want to bring yoga to you guys, I think at first there was a little bit of suspicion, which rightly so. I think there was a little bit of suspicion that I might be trying to come into this geek space nefariously to try and get money from folks. And bringing a message of, that same old thing of like, get out of your parents' basement, stop eating Doritos, and like get to the gym. But right?
And
but
you're like, no, just put the game down for a second and do a little of this breathing and moving, and then you can go back to your game.
Right. It's like, exactly. Just have to pause for a second.
Yeah.
So I met with the guy who was running it at the time, and I think once he met me, he was like, oh, like, she's really just this strange human being who also happens to be a yoga teacher who wants to find a way to do this. So sure, come on over. And that's when I started working out kind of the kinks in what YogaQuest would eventually be. And it literally did not take long for people to start showing up for my class, which shocked me. I thought for sure this could be an epic fail. This could be one of those things that I'm talking about 10 years from now, that like, hey, I had this just ridiculous idea and it flopped. But it seems like there was a need there. Folks didn't even realize it was a need. And they were really excited when somebody came in and said, hey, I'm here. Let's try and make this thing work together.
Wow. And so when you first started doing it, was it all like fully fleshed out as like the storytelling thing? Did you already like have that in mind? Like, how did you come up with this idea, like to make it something that they could have fun with? To put like a narrative structure into it. How did that come about in your thinking? Because that's not what they do in Core Power, you know?
No, oh no, it's definitely not. So I mean, we were talking about kind of universe moments. This would definitely be one. I was engaged in my own practice. I was still practicing in Core Power at the time, and I was laying in Shavasana. I'd already been percolating on some of this stuff, and it just kind of came to me in that moment, like, what's meaningful to geeks? Stories. What if the yoga class was a story? What if it was like a video game? What if you are the hobbits walking to Mordor, or you're you are the boat they're traveling in, or you are the monster that they're facing? And that it just sort of came into being. And the stories were terrible in the beginning. Just real bad. But it was like so many pilots. It just really needed to find its feet.
Well, it also seems like, I don't know, there's a certain probably just like kind of vibe. Like when you met with the guy from the Geek Society, or the girl, I don't know if it was a guy or girl, but you met the folks from the Geek Society. They're just like, oh, she's got a vibe where you're like, oh, that'll be okay.
Right. Yeah, that'll be okay.
I don't know. She got a, you know what I mean? Somebody's in the room and they feel like you can get on their vibe, or whatever that is.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure even if it was a little bit loose at the beginning, just like the vibe was there. You're like, hey, look, you're welcome here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm going to talk about dorky stuff that you're going to maybe think is cool, maybe not, but you're going to feel welcome because it's going to be dorky,
Right, exactly.
Right. All right. So do you remember the first time you ever tried to teach one of these yoga? Was it called YogaQuest from the beginning? Did you start with a name, or did that come later?
It came very early on. I can't remember if the very first class was called YogaQuest or not. That's a little bit of a blur. Okay. It might have just been like narrated yoga class, but but we may have come up with the name by then. I was desperate to find a name. I was like, this thing, it exists, so it needs to be named.
Your marketing got better over time.
Yes, definitely. Oh yeah, and picking out a logo went through a bunch of like Lord of the Ringsy flaming rings, and anyway. So that first class. So I didn't think it out very well. Like, I had written up this narrative, I had put some yoga in there, and then I was like, wait, I can't teach the class and narrate this thing. And it was maybe an hour before I was supposed to teach the class. So I call up a friend of mine who is an improv actor, and I was like, hey, can I hand you a script and have you read it for an hour?
Oh, so you just you led a class while he read this thing?
Yeah. So she became our first narrator. So most of our YogaQuest classes, our flagship YogaQuest classes, are narrated. And what we do is we have one person read the script and the other person leads the yoga.
So does the program of asana correspond with stuff in the story? Is that the idea?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes.
And do you rename poses to fit the story?
So, example, let's say we're doing a class that's based on Star Trek, the original series. Mm-hmm. I'll pick a fandom that at least people have heard of. So the script might say something like, Captain Kirk said to Spock, "Go get Bones." And Kirk is a chair pose, and Spock is a goddess pose with live long and prosper hands, and Bones is a forward fold. So when you hear Kirk, you do the chair pose, and then when they say Spock, you do the goddess pose, and then when they say Bones, you do the forward fold. And it goes on like that through the story. And names are repeated, so it's not like you're doing this learning new stuff through the whole class. Did that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And the reason I'm laughing is it's very silly.
Yes.
And I appreciate that a lot. Like, I kind of go to great lengths to get as much silly into my class as I can. Because I've always felt like there's something very spiritual about silly.
Yes.
Like, I used to be really serious and brooding for a lot of years in practice, and I thought that made it more spiritual. But at a certain point, I felt it was revealed to me that was not the case, that really I was just very uptight. And so I found all these kind of ways that are very dorky to try to get people to be a little bit silly. Because I do think, especially when you're dealing with your body and stuff that has to do with you as a person, which is also sometimes challenging, a little bit of silly is helpful.
Absolutely. And I've heard of laughter yoga, and I think we are, like, I don't want to diss laughter yoga. I don't know enough about it.
Well, I've seen it. It seems like you sort of fake laugh until it becomes real laugh. Yeah,
see, what bugs me is, like, we just do stuff that's funny so you laugh.
Yeah. You don't have to fake it.
You don't have to fake it.
You just got to be funny.
Right? And even when I bomb, when I'm not funny, like, that in itself is funny, because I'll say, like, well, I guess that one didn't land, and they're like, oh.
Yes, you can turn the bomb into an asset, of course.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, all right, so that gives a kind of fun picture of, like, what that class is like. And so you start launching this thing, and so how does it become... It grows from there, like people start coming to the classes. I'm sure as you continue to do it, you start to get a little bit better at it and, like, start to find out what works with it more.
Yep. We tried out a few different things. People kept saying that they wanted it to be more like a Dungeons and Dragons situation where there were character classes and you could level up. And we tried that for a minute, and I was like, I don't like this because you're not leveling up. Yeah, because I just kept giving everybody points for everything.
Everybody levels up, eh?
Right.
I like
exactly.
that. As long as the leveling up has nothing to do with their ability to do poses, then I think you'd be good to go. But as soon as it started to become about poses, I think you'd be in trouble.
Well, right, because I never wanted it to be that way. People just, they're so into game mentality. They want to gamify things. And so, they want to win points. And I was like, you get points for coming. And they're like, no.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.